So having looked at the legislative arm of government, what we're now going to do is look at the executive arm. And the executive arm is actually charged with running the government. Now, according to our constitution federally, that's vested in the Queen, it's actually carried out by the Governor-General, who acts on the Queen's behalf. And even the Governor-General acts on the advice of the Federal Executive Council, which is the elected party. So what we have is largely a kind of ceremonial role for our head of state, the Queen and the Queen's representative, the Governor-General, with most of the action coming from the elected government, who acts as the Federal Executive Council. Okay, we have the same structure that occurs in the states as well, only we have different terms. So the Crown's representative is the Governor, not the Governor-General. We also have a Premier, not a Prime Minister. And what happens is that the Federal Executive Council is a special selection of the House of Representatives coming from the party that's gotten the most votes. They decide who's going to run various aspects of the government's work. Those aspects of the work are called ministries. So there's the Education Ministry, the Health Ministry at the state level, and we've got, different ministries at the federal level, like the Foreign Affairs Ministry, etc. And so what we have is someone's put in charge of that. A member who's been elected into the House of Representatives or the Senate is put in charge of a part of the government's business. So they become part of the executive arm of government. All those people together are called the Cabinet. Now they're appointed by the Governor-General on the advice of the Prime Minister. So in essence, the Prime Minister says, this is who we want to do the job, and the Governor-General signs off on it. Part of the other difference that I didn't cover, which is it's worth knowing, is that at the state level, it's called the Governor-in-Council, not the Federal Executive Council, who's responsible for actually running the government. Part of the uniqueness of our system lies in the position of Governor-General. This is not a constitutional law segment, so suffice to say that the Governor-General generally acts on advice of the government. So it's not like they really have this independent power to do things. Having said that, there are some special circumstances where they might actually make decisions and do things. There was a time in the mid-70s when Gough Whitlam was in power, when the Governor-General exercised some very unusual powers. So there's some contention over how much power the Governor-General actually has. But really, for our purposes, the Governor-General and the Governor acts on the advice of the government of the day. So I think I've been through most of the things on this slide. In essence, members of either of the houses, representatives, upper or lower house, because it could be state or federal, are given a ministry if they've decided. There are more senior ministries and more junior ministries, and those in the senior ministries actually go on to be called part of what's called cabinet, which is a smaller selection of ministers who do much more in the decision making about the running of the government. Anyone who's not actually appointed to a ministry, they're called a backbencher. So if you ever hear that term, that backbencher means just someone who is a member of the political party who's in government, but they don't actually have a ministry or a defined area of responsibility in the executive arm of government. But just like in our legal system, we have this adversarial system in Parliament where the next most populous party, so the one with the second biggest number of votes, are called the opposition. And they try to hold the government to account by asking questions in Parliament, etc. To help them do that, the leader of the opposition will often appoint a shadow cabinet, which is where they have specific members of the opposition. So they're in Parliament, but they're not part of the party who's won government. They will actually be given shadow ministries. So they're meant to look in greater detail at the actions of the minister responsible for running that executive arm of government. And as I've said before, there's a subset of ministers who can be called cabinet, who in essence have a lot more power to run the government. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of running the government is that often Parliament won't make all of the specific rules required when they pass something into law. what we can see is that the legislation that passes Parliament will have the principles and objectives of a regulation, but how that will be run, the detailed rules and regulations, that's called delegated legislation. That can be given to someone else to write. That can be given to government departments or local governments. So we can see that there is this delegation of power to the executive in very limited circumstances. And again, this is subject to court review to make sure that the powers given to this executive arm of government aren't too large, aren't too great. And why would that be? Because if they gave them too much power, it would be a breach of our separation of powers, right? Okay, so we can see how this works. The detailed rules are left to government departments or councils or other statutory bodies as delegated legislation. The overarching principles and objectives of the legislation need to be passed by Parliament. So these laws are called various names, and we can see here they're bylaws, orders in council, etc. They can have the same effect of an act of Parliament, but what we do find is that the delegation of the power must be passed by Parliament. So there's an accountability mechanism there built in through Parliament. We need it for lots of different reasons. Legislation can be time consuming. You might need to pass rules at certain times of the year when Parliament's not actually sitting. And often the technical elements of how a rule applies are best not handled by politicians. They're best handled by people who actually know in a lot of detail what's likely to happen when you put a rule in place. Let me give you an example. Just say there was a first homeowners grant. Well, what part of the problem becomes, who writes the rules as to what constitutes a home? Right? So if I put a caravan on a block of land and live in it, do I get the homeowners grant? Or do I need a slab of concrete? Or do I need electricity connected to it? At what point do I actually get a home that qualifies for the grant? So you can see that's quite a technical question, and people could be trying to game that system in lots of ways. And that's often what the executive people will do in the delegated legislation, work out what rules should and do actually apply. So we can see here a couple of examples of delegated legislation. That we've got the Tobacco Plain Packaging Regulations 2011. Now they put into place, right, what the government wanted to do as part of the Tobacco Plain Packaging Act. So the regulations are delegated legislation arising from the Act. So that's probably enough on the executive government. We're going to move on to the judiciary in the next podcast.